At 75, Margaret finally stood on the threshold of a silence she had not known for over 5 decades, watching the dust motes dance in the light of a house that no longer vibrated with the heavy, unpredictable footsteps of her husband Arthur. The decision to leave hadn't come as a sudden bolt of lightning, but rather as a slow, agonizing erosion of her soul until there was nothing left but a jagged core of self-preservation that finally screamed for air. For 50 years, her existence had been a master class in hypervigilance, a rhythmic dance of measuring the exact volume of her voice, the precise timing of dinner, and the careful curation of her own opinions to ensure they never collided with Arthur's fragile yet suffocating ego. She remembered the early years when his possessiveness felt like a passionate intensity, a misguided belief that his constant questioning of her whereabouts and his subtle belittling of her intelligence were merely symptoms of a love too big to contain. But as the decades rolled on, that intensity curdled into a cold, systematic dismantling of her identity, leaving her a ghost in her own kitchen, a woman who apologized for the weather and the way the light hit the floorboards. The toxicity was not always a roar. Often it was a whisper, a raised eyebrow that silenced her mid-sentence, or a week-long silence that punished her for an imagined slight she could never quite identify. She had stayed for the children, then for the grandchildren, and then out of a paralyzing fear that the world outside their front door was too vast, and she was too small to navigate it alone. She had convinced herself that endurance was a virtue, and that her suffering was a sacrificial lamb on the altar of a stable home, never realizing that the stability was a facade built on her own exhaustion. Now, looking at the suitcases packed with the remnants of a life she barely recognized, the weight of the realization hit her. She had traded her youth, her dreams, and her very breath for a peace that was actually just a hostage negotiation. The regret was a physical ache, a heavy stone in her chest as she contemplated the thousands of sunrises she had greeted with dread rather than hope. The middle years of her marriage had been a blur of calculated invisibility, where she learned to navigate the minefield of Arthur's moods with the precision of a bomb disposal expert, yet the explosions were inevitable and always her fault. She recalled a specific afternoon in her 40s when she had dared to enroll in a local pottery class, a tiny flicker of her old creative self reaching for the light, only to have Arthur spend 3 hours explaining how her absence from the home for 2 hours a week was a direct assault on the family's foundation and a sign of her inherent selfishness. He didn't hit her with fists. He hit her with logic that twisted reality until she felt insane, making her believe that her desire for a hobby was a betrayal of her duty as a wife. This was the psychological warfare that defined their silver anniversary, a celebration of 25 years of her shrinking while he expanded to fill every room. She had become an expert at reading the micro-expressions on his face, knowing before he even spoke whether the evening would be spent in icy isolation or under the heat of his relentless criticism of her cooking, her appearance, or her parenting. Her children grew up in a house where the air was always thin, learning to walk on eggshells just as she did, and the guilt of that legacy was a bitter pill she swallowed every night. She had watched her friends travel, start businesses, and grow into themselves, while she remained frozen in a perpetual state of girlhood, never allowed to mature into an independent woman, because independence was a threat to the fragile ecosystem of Arthur's control. Every time she thought of leaving during those years, he would switch tactics, offering a week of terrifyingly sweet affection that felt like a trap, making her doubt her own perceptions of his cruelty. It was a cycle of intermittent reinforcement that kept her tethered to a sinking ship, convinced that if she just worked a little harder, stayed a little quieter, or loved him a little more perfectly, The man she thought she married would finally return. By the time she reached her 60s, the toxicity had evolved into a weary, mutual silence that felt less like peace and more like a graveyard. Yet the control remained absolute and suffocating. She found herself sitting in the garden for hours, staring at the soil, imagining herself buried beneath it just to escape the relentless pressure of being watched and judged by a man who viewed her not as a partner, but as a piece of property that had failed to provide him with total satisfaction. The loneliness was profound because it lived within the presence of another person. She was more solitary in a room with Arthur than she ever was when he left for his occasional fishing trips. She started to notice the physical toll the stress was taking, the chronic tremors in her hands, the permanent tension in her shoulders, and a digestive system that revolted at every meal shared across a table of unspoken resentment. She had become a master of the gray rock method before she even knew there was a name for it, making herself as uninteresting and unresponsive as possible to avoid drawing his fire. But this required her to bury her true self so deep that she feared she had actually died years ago. The realization that she was waiting for him to die so she could finally start living was the most horrifying thought she ever had. Yet it became a daily companion, a dark secret she tucked away behind her polite smiles at church and the supermarket. She saw her reflection in the darkened window of the oven and didn't recognize the woman looking back. The eyes were hollow, reflecting a life spent in the service of a tyrant's whims. She had become a shell, a repository for his anger and a mirror for his insecurities, and the sheer waste of her intellectual and emotional potential felt like a crime for which there was no statute of limitations. The breaking point arrived on her 75th birthday, not with a grand confrontation, but with a small, insignificant moment involving a broken teacup that shattered the final illusion of her endurance. Arthur had screamed at her for 10 minutes about her clumsiness, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the bruise on her spirit, and for the first time in 50 years, she didn't apologize. She simply looked at him and realized he was a small, pathetic man who had spent his life trying to diminish a woman who was infinitely greater than him. The fear that had kept her paralyzed for decades suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that she would rather spend her last few years in a cardboard box under a bridge than spend one more night under his roof. She began the secret process of untangling her life, a terrifying ordeal involving hidden documents, hushed phone calls to a lawyer she found in the yellow pages, and the slow realization that her children, now grown and scarred themselves, were her biggest supporters in this late-blooming rebellion. Leaving was a military operation. She waited for him to go to a doctor's appointment and, with the help of her daughter, moved the essentials into a small apartment she had rented with the secret savings she'd managed to hide over the years in a grocery tin. As she drove away from the driveway for the last time, she didn't cry. She breathed a sigh so deep it felt like it came from her very toes, a literal expulsion of 50 years of held breath. The house in her rearview mirror looked like a mausoleum, and she was the only one who had managed to claw her way out of the tomb. Now, living in her small, sun-drenched apartment, Margaret is learning the alphabet of freedom at an age when most people are closing their books, and the bitterness of her regret is balanced only by the sweetness of her solitude. She revels in the simple miracles, eating toast for dinner because she wants to, leaving the dishes until morning without fear of a lecture, and choosing the color of her own curtains without seeking permission from a man who hated brightness. She spends her mornings in the local park, watching young couples and wanting to scream at the women to value their boundaries, to recognize the red flags before they become a shroud, and to understand that for better or worse was never meant to be a suicide pact. She is haunted by the what ifs, the career she might have had, the places she might have seen, the version of herself that wasn't crushed under the weight of a toxic ego, but she refuses to let the regret consume the precious time she has left. She has started painting again, her hands still shaking, but her spirit steady, filling canvases with vibrant, chaotic colors that Arthur would have despised. Her life was wasted in the sense that she gave the best of her years to a void that could never be filled, but she is determined that the final chapter will be a masterpiece of her own design. She is 75. She is alone. And for the first time in her entire existence, she is absolutely, undeniably happy, proving that while it is a tragedy to wait so long, it is never too late to reclaim the soul you thought you had lost forever.